Welcome to the Green Ring, and thanks for watching. This video is the fourth in a group of 6 presenting a note-by-note analysis of Wagner's Das Rheingold Scene 3. Built on nearly 2 centuries of scholarly literature, its massive journey aspires to examine the whole of Der Ring des Nibelungen to its final note. I hope you'll take this voyage with me, one I'm dedicated to completing. For an explanation of who I am and more on the reasons for this series, please check out my preface video. Its link is supplied below, along with those for the other videos preceding this one. We pick up where we left off in Dover's full score on the first stave of page 189 as Loge begins his barrage of flattery which goads Alberich into revealing far more than the vainglorious dwarf should. The following dialogue between the gods and Alberich leads to the dwarf's peroration on his ghastly plans for the world, a sequence Darcy views as a 9-part rondo. The intensity of this scene, in relation to anything which has gone before, is awe-inspiring. While Tanner refers to all of Scene 2, this portion is its conceptual locus, beginning with Loge merrily heaping sly compliments on the dwarf that eventually prod him into his fatal mistake. Launched by a single initiating horn woodwind minim chord, the syntax resides solely in voice and string choir, as it lingers on a bundle of modules in continuous evolution. It begins with the flurry of second violin viola triplets, low strings rushing up a distinctly modeled scale. This begins on 3 rising notes reminiscent of Erde melody notes, then continues on that 6-note rising figure whose embryonic import so far suggests nothing so much as vain hopes. Taken together, this scale is also a neat inversion of the spear. At its crest, first violins begin a long series of Loge variants, that same module which has only just epitomized the fire god's taunting. Here, however, they initiate on the rhythm which will mold a great deal of Loge syntax to follow, all as a reminder of the satirical nod to the ring's powers. Beneath first violins, cellos outline first a descending scale, then 3 pulses of melody notes, eerie foreshadowing of a key morpheme about to be introduced. Loge's vocal, while freer, is still built from familiar syntactic elements, starting with the plunging 4th to mitigate the ominous descending 5th with which Alberich has just ended his line. The fire sprite's positive influence ironically strengthened by a rising octave. Tangentially, it should be noted this juxtaposition of a falling interval with a stoutly rising one is a device the Meister often uses to add powerful emphasis to a phrase. It's not coincidental that while the intervals are different, it's the basis of Wotan's Scene 2 appreciation of the ring's power, and even informs fate. The fire sprite continues, intoning a downward scale, doubling the cello line, to then contradict it with reverse melody notes, which, with further prescient irony, launch the bass's melody note strophes. He continues with a rising arpeggio reminiscent both of the heroic melody notes and the giant Scene 2 defiance, which he finishes on a last rising scale, both echoing the cello bass while more precisely aligning to extended melody notes. As a last sidelight, the rise and fall of the initial cello bass even injects a subtle implication of Erde twilight. In short, while seeming to complement the dwarf's achievements, Loge also implies their far-reaching scope for disaster, an outcome in which he himself plays a central role. Last and most subtly, the rising arpeggio in his vocal surreptitiously includes the giants in this heady mix, while the melody note suggests that, while Alberich imagines himself master, the forces of nature give that illusion the lie. Loge's rhetorical method is equally revealing. Covert manipulation, as in scheming, may be ideal for Mima, a creature devious as the fire god himself, but Alberich's taunts have just proven he requires different handling. The Rheingold trap set by Erda and Loge and sprung by the Rhine maidens is designed to snare that one particular entity most deeply woundable through their pride. Evil as he is, Alberich is first and foremost a creature of immense self-importance. Loge merely tickles that pride, and with no more coercion, the dwarf openly reveals his plans for world conquest. Such arrogance is only too familiar to the fire god who, from the moment he appears, has to deal with little else from Wotan. Now he plays immortal and dwarf against one another, seeming to admire Alberich's new-built kingdom of night, while giving Wotan the impression such approbation is only a device to trap his enemy. In the process, however, the fire god adroitly fans the flames of hatred between them both. The vainglorious dwarf responds by patting himself on the back to a varied repetition of the previous bundle, raised by a second, his voice indicatively following the Erda Twilight hint in the bass line, complete with reverse chord note conclusion, mimicking Loge. Ironically, this phrase also mimics the rising-falling turn in the fire sprite's advice for stealing the ring. The fire god ends this first reprise, chiming in with more empty flattery by rising a sixth into an inverted ash interval whose falling pitch is a dire octave, contradicting his previous false optimism, and followed by another three-note crib of the melody notes as the harmony modulates into minor, ideal introduction for a new morpheme with a strong, if quirky and largely misunderstood influence on the epic. This almost universally recognized ascending three-note figure sounds on bassoon's bass clarinet, low strings repeatedly giving it impetus with its truncation in the form of reverse chord notes, while octavo violins, violas maintain a continuous triplet pulse. As an interesting sidelight, the combination of these two cells also implies a continuous chain of chagrin iterations. Volkswagen calls this syntax motive of the rising treasure, refined by Kobe to rising hoard motive, and Newman simply to hoard, which Hutchinson embellishes as the hoard of the Nibelungs, Holman and Cook preferring Newman's simpler version. Spencer Millington or Donington appear to notice the syntax, while, in his own distinctive way, Sabor favors treasure. Cook feels this morpheme rises from the last three notes of the ring, meaning that both spring from the Erda melody notes. While the syntax plays a continuing role throughout the dwarf's fulminations, mention of the hoard itself quickly vanishes, as he instead dwells on the intimidation he aspires to wield over the races of the world with the hoard as his tool. This implies a vast social picture extending far beyond any mere hoard of gold itself, an idea which justifies itself as pure realism without need for complex allegorical rationales. Alberich makes his hoard boast vocally on a Welterb triad, then a static world ash interval capped with a downward fourth, meaning his racial aspirations followed by two strong indicators of natural power. His next and echoing static interval drops a fifth, then rises a fourth into melody notes, his defiant module, to descend a sixth in parody of Loge's unique vocal module. Under him, the bassoon bass clarinet line extends its hoard pulse into that six-note figure of vain aspirations, embellished by an upward arpeggio in low strings, reminiscent of Erda, then doubles the dwarf's sixth. The throbbing string chord's harsh minor seventh harmony then resolves into placid major mode, its triplets now regular marcato quavers, as Wotan mildly notes the hoard is of little use in Nibelheim. His first phrase begins in a low ash interval on a fourth, a gentle parody of Alberich. After sinking a fifth, the god outlines a faint crib, rests a minim, then slides down a hint of resignation, tailed out by a pulse suggesting Freya. The dwarf responds as the strings resume their heated triplets, his two vocal chord notes echoing a pair of woodwind Erda chords in their harshest minor form, now indelibly associated with power over his transformed Nibelungs. On the first chord of each, muted octavo horns pause the string triplets while adding a harsh edge to the woodwinds. He gloats that the underworld serves to hide his scheme, a thought he closes atop a gentler half-cadence in two dotted minim string chords, voice leaping up a fifth on a low ash interval into an abrasive strophe on the words Nibelheim's Nacht, the module almost tranquil here, yet still rife with his threat cell. He presses on, writing another chord development lower to fourth. Begun on static notes after a minim rest, his vocal bounces on fifths to rise a fourth as beneath him cellos begin a chord pulse that becomes a long melodic line begun with two rising arpeggiations, the first almost heroic melody notes, the second an inversion of the ring fragment topped by the fragment itself. Alberich's vocal roughly follows this line as he extols the wonders he'll work, his vocal peak a rising and falling Welterb triad, a backward reminiscence of Wotan's similar aspirations, along with the broad, eerie foreshadowing of Heir de Twilight and their pairing of betrayal with racial urges. After the cello line's second arpeggiated ascent, its ring fragment descent leads to the dwarf's boldest claim yet. Die ganze Welt gewinne ich mit ihm mir zu eigen. This gauntlet he sings on a fifth, rising into a broad, low-ash interval on a third, the whole outlining an abandonment triad, followed by a dire, plunging octave and rising seventh on Weltgewinn. He caps the whole a cappella with triplet reverse melody notes which, after a fourth descent, become a reverse chord note opposition separated by a third lift. Devoid of vocals, the coda to the dwarf's initial outburst of hubris returns to Loge's flattery and its spear-challenging scale. With this current evolution, however, the formerly static violin-viola triplets hurl themselves defiantly upward in two-octave leaps, Alberich's certainty he's conquered nature's power exactly as Wotan has done, a flourish terminated by a syncopated ring fragment. Reinforced by woodwind crotchets as the strings fall in quaver arpeggiation, it slyly incorporates a lengthened sense of those defiantly paired impacts from the giant Scene 2 outrage. As strings quiet to pedal chords, the Immortal's response, a gentle nudge for more details, suggests he's grudgingly picked up on Loge's diplomatic style, slowly assimilating what the fire sprite has brought him here to learn. Wotan's vocal is a mild bundle, launched by a low ash interval on subtle reverse chord notes, expanding after a politic falling sixth and rising third into reverse melody and chord notes, making it a truncation of the earlier Loge vocal, both encouraging and cautioning him, here almost a parody of Alberich's immediately previous line, not to mention the dwarf's Scene 1 wooing. The Immortal's veiled sneer, calling his adversary Gütiger, inspires in the dwarf what amounts to an aria on the topic of vanquishing the human world, followed by that of the Immortal. Alberich begins with a picture of life in the sun over the gentlest of violin-viola tremolos, arco-low string pedals slowly outlining reverse melody notes. From static notes, the dwarf's equally lulling vocal pivots on fourths through a low ash interval to rise on reverse chord notes into a static ash interval. Then, after a derisive turn reminiscent of his failed Scene 1 wooing, he sketches a grace distortion of fate, then falls silent for almost 3 measures. This inspires a solo violin to rise atop the strings in a pulse of Freya's first module, vaguely soured by chromatics, its melody notes and rising tritone repeated twice with a kind of sardonic glee, while oboes breathe 2 pairs of Erde chords. It's an eerily ironic ghost of the moment in Scene 2 when Fricka mulls whether schmuck created through the ring's power can ensure a spouse's fidelity. Here it tails out with violin-viola tremolos syncing chromatically just as they do when capping the Scene 2 episode, though without Rheingold tattoos and on reverse melody notes, mirrored in low strings. During this, Alberich threatens with his Goldner Faust to a low ash interval on a third, then a reverse on chord notes capped by another wooing turn, which rises through melody notes into the threat of a plunging fifth. As bookending, which validates Darcy's rondo assessment, Loge's flattery syntax returns, but in a uniquely informative variant. The scale more than doubles in length, an aggressive emphasis on Alberich's resolve for victory over the gods. Triplet string pulses twice leap on upward octaves in the way of the module's first sounding, mark of the natural energy the dwarf means to have for himself, which already flares in Nibelung forges. Finally, reverse melody notes on high woodwinds' upper horns oppose the melody notes proper on lower horns' octave or low strings, that same module which is the basis of the horde. This juxtaposition, destined to have impact all across the drama, here in Nibelheim already plays a major role, the three reversed notes dominating Alberich's brutal tyranny over his Nibelung race, just before their reversal in the horde first makes itself felt. It's also notable the Meister leaves this segue entirely without words to highlight its syntax, a fearsome gauntlet of Nibelung determination. The texture stills on a tremolo string pedal, a jarring shift from the prior raucous threat, and Alberich moves directly to a pivotal morpheme based on those same reversed melody notes, to a pair of nearly complete orchestral renunciation pulses. As the morpheme first sounds in Scene 1, he swears he'll make all the world renounce love exactly as he's done, though here in triple rather than duple time. While rhythmically broader than its original, like that first instance, this one is scored exclusively on low brass. It's the first time that choir sounds for any substantive part of the episode, a brilliant coup of orchestration given the scene's pervasively ominous tone even without the brass's help. Tremolo strings return to intone a single pair of air chords, then step aside for the next renunciation strophe on brass, which becomes an acerbic pulse of resignation. As a last but important detail, timpani ceremoniously introduce each of these two renunciation strophes with a single Valhalla ash strophe as an upbeat to the next measure. Freed by the orchestra, which takes the morpheme exclusively, the dwarf's vocal is an angular, ceremonial descant, paired phrases of repeated static notes with a handful of leaping pitches, the whole built almost entirely from self-contradicting world ash intervals. Lifting into the first renunciation strophe, he sings one of the only full intervals he's ever vouchsafed, albeit on a sinister tritone, to sink after holding the note a semi-breve with a much broader inverted interval on a fourth. Then, with the help of another low, his vocal alone adds renunciation's reverse chord notes. After a dotted minim rest, his second phrase resumes by exactly following Voglinda's original vocal, with its pathetic rising sixth, while tremolo strings conclude their chord note pulse. He sustains this top note for a semi-breve, echoing his first phrase while allowing full voice for the syntax's reverse melody notes on brass. After punctuating it with a minim rest, he sinks a third to finish his last low ash interval on reverse chord notes, thus again supplying those in the syntax itself. He concludes this remarkable passage with the word entsagen on the direst of plunging octaves. The solo violin wails out of this magnificently doom-laden passage, dismissing the brass on a chromatic rising quaver scale that finishes in another bitter Freya strophe. Its last notes again repeat 3 times with insidious malice, this time doubled in their entirety by first clarinet, while tremolo second violins twice reinforce only the melody notes of its last 2 pulses, oboes sighing air chords. Out of this macabre bundle, the violin solo falls across 2 measures in an arpeggio whose diminished harmonies evoke the ring fragment. The dwarf's pungent vocal, begun after nearly 3 measures rest during the violin's last Freya pulse, threatens that all life shall long only for gold as he leaps up a 4th to repeat his lustful turn, a low ash interval on a 3rd, a pathetic descent of a 6th, from which he leaps up a tritone into another lusting turn, capped by a baleful downward 5th. This triggers the orchestra in a furious, wordless repeat of his threatening bundle raised a 2nd, a pillar of Darcy's rondo form which also follows the Meister's practice of repeating syntax he particularly means to have impact. Anticipatory string tremolos calm on one subtle air-to-chord pulse, its last chord reinforced by bassoons. Alberich, having disposed of the world that resides beneath Valhalla's shadow, goes on to picture the gods in their fool's paradise above. Strings and soft horns build 4 iterations of Valhalla Part 1's rising second half, which, it should be recalled, is built on air-to-melody notes, each pulse stroked on its last crotchet by rising triplet clarinet arpeggios, a seemingly purely decorative flourish, which even so hints subtly at the giant's hand in building the fortress. The dwarf's tonic note vocal echoes a pair of falling, rising, falling signs that hint at the full Valhalla Part 1, syntactic child of the ring, and most fundamentally, Erda, while also shaping the line across an inverted ash interval. It should be noted his vocal resembles that subtle combination of an anti-natural with a natural sign first introduced by Fasold's Scene 2 outrage at Wotan's duplicity. Still embellished by clarinet arpeggios, one strophe of Valhalla Part 3 concludes this memory of Scene 1's paean to the fortress. Its air-to-chords are intact, but its world ash coda is horrifically distorted, as the dwarf intones its ash interval as an inverted on a plunging octave, meaning a truncation of Valhalla Part 4, lacking its full cadence and Freya love module. Alberich goes on to recognize the immortal's contempt for him with what are among the most remarkable measures in all Rheingold, a look far ahead into the epic, which is spectacularly prescient even for the Meister. All instruments which sound in the passage are allotted their own staves, lacking only horns, which, as they double the cello's Valhalla syntax, are omitted, while viola's first cellos are notated in treble clef. Valhalla Part 3's air-to-chords conclude the previous section, with the harmony briefly curdling as it moves through reverse chord notes in first violas, supported by first cello's reverse melody notes, yet opposed in contrabasses by the melody notes themselves, the first clarinet arpeggio distorting with them, while second violas add a trill appoggiatura's hint of sexually frustrated contempt. Leaving horns behind, a dense yet efficient counterpoint on strings alone shifts through a single measure of diminished minor 7th harmony, and whether by tortuous happenstance or conscious design, viola's cellos weave a crisscross foreshadowing of the Norn's rope of fate, a hint not made flesh until Götterdämmerung. But there's more. Violas begin by sounding atop first cellos as all 3 voices weave a falling rising sign potently implying the ring, a combination that sounds its fragment most prominently. Second cellos support this with a downward turn whose rising portion echoes the contrabass's immediately prior melody notes. In the next measure, the mode shifts to pure minor, as both viola choirs and first cellos join in a massed pulse of those melody notes, violas intoning a rising-falling sign, while the rising first cello scale crosses above them. With the next measure, the ensemble joins in a major mode cadence begun in first viola's cellos by another melody note strophe, rather sunnily harmonized, the seductive frisson of another trill appoggiatura on second cellos beneath. Having thus climbed over violas, first cellos continue with the ghost of Alberich's ominous threat, and in the final measure, together with the returned horns, joins violas in the Valhalla Part 1 iteration, second cellos intoning a quasi-treaty arpeggio, bass clarinet resuming the triplet arpeggio. Beside this wealth of detail, Alberich's vocal may appear sparse, but it makes up an impact for what it lacks in complexity. He reproduces Loge's down-up sign from Scene 2, the fire god's caution of this expedition's perils, and the dwarf ends it here with melody notes, precisely aligned to those in the orchestra. He finishes this prescient moment with subtle force by referring to the immortals as ewigen Schwelger, with an alteration of his threatening morphine. The sensuous second cello trill appoggiatura launches this vocal module, while first cellos double it at a slight parallax, precisely aligned to its melody notes. Then, doubled by horns, first cellos, the following Valhalla syntax is itself a variant on the melody notes. This most basic of Erida modules overwhelmingly dominates the sequence, two strophes almost back-to-back in the dwarf's vocal. The one line in all this complexity audiences are most likely to decipher. This is an object lesson in the vital importance of reflecting the work's syntax in staging visuals. Its syntax leaves no doubt the dwarf has already grasped his vision for the world is opposed not merely by Wotan's clan, but the very Earth Mother herself, a threat the following sequence demonstrates he's more than prepared to meet. Only some prescient vision of Alberich's Götterdämmerung machinations can hope to make sense of the passage. As his vocal finishes on a descending Erida fourth, the brief episode ends with the final measure of the lulling Valhalla Part 1 pulse strung with another clarinet arpeggio. As a final note, it's worth mentioning Valhalla and Nibelheim don't make quite such odd bedfellows as one might think. Most of Scene 3 is set in some variant of triple time, a meter which is also the most comfortable home for Wotan's fortress, as it becomes later for the world of the Gibbetschungs under Hagen. A fermata caps this, one of the work's few authentic cadences, allowing its dreamy Valhalla digression to sink in. The dwarf shatters this reverie with harsh warning cries, the first on reverse chord notes, the second a challenging upward fifth, each punctuated by blaring marcato crotchet string chords which, together with Alberich's vocal notes, evoke those double impacts from the giant's outrage. The second initiates a low string pedal on an octavo tremolo, over which the aspiring tyrant's quasi-recitative describes the debasement of Valhalla's men and the loveless rape of its women, a vocal especially rich in syntax. He begins with a low ash interval on a third, a tragic falling sixth, rising a third into melody notes, and a chord note opposition. From there, he lifts a third as he brings up the women on a remarkable echo of his own Scene 1 despair, which is, of course, the embryonic form of Freya's love cell. He follows, after a quaver rest and a harsh rising tritone, by singing the words, Sie zwingt zur Lust sich der Zwerg, to a low ash interval on a third leading to his own wrathful morphine. A harsh marcato sting punches its top note, then, after a crotchet rest initiating a crotchet semi-brevi pedal chord, the dwarf intones resignation to inspire the strictly orchestral return of the furious rondo parentheses module. Horn woodwind chording supports its rising string octaves, cut short on a harsh sting before their melody note juxtaposition can sound, as Alberich laughs to an inverted ring fragment, destined to play a key role in his curse, followed by static notes and a belligerent upward fourth. This prepares a reprise of the horde, viola's cellos hammering away at static octavo triplets, its central module intoned here on bassoon's contrabasses, their line incorporating its reverse chord notes, making these pulses the syntax's most extended spear-opposing versions of the Erida melody notes. The dwarf's vocal, almost entirely on the single note of B-flat, first thrums a pair of swiftly repeated notes to Habacht, separated by broad rests to again reflect those double impacts from the giant's outrage. He follows with a group of static ash intervals, interrupted only by a third bounce up on the word Hort, whose subtle continuation in further static B-flats on an approximation of the Nibelung tattoo rhythm is only too apt. The whole line, a promise, his nächtlichen Heer, will rise into daylight. Beneath the last half of this harangue, the bassoon contrabass line rises chromatically into furious woodwind-horned air-chord strophes, specifically in their power of the ring form. With the first of these, Alberich's vocal leaps up and down on thirds, moving through a static ash interval to end on another, this one a low, which rises a fifth to evoke the threat of his Nibelung slaves as potentially a heroic force to match Wotan's. This triggers the Rheingold tattoo, blaring on trumpets, its first ash interval here a static one, the gold's power come to roost squarely in Nibelheim. The entire morpheme capped with a raucous strophe of Valhalla Part 1 on strings, horns, woodwinds, and a wild cymbal roll, all of which terminate with a brazen crash to conclude the dwarf's gauntlet. This aria, in which Alberich describes his plans to vanquish gods and world, is the sole fount of the ring as an allegory for greed. In it, the dwarf outlines his plans for the gold with much fervor, but few specifics. Mit goldner Faust euch göttliche fang ich mir alle, wie ich der Liebe abgesagt, alles was lebt soll ihr entsagen, mit Golde gekehrt, nach Gold nur sollt ihr noch gieren. This describes his intent beautifully, without giving the least idea of how it's to be achieved. Moreover, only one of its concepts, mit Golde gekehrt, nach Gold nur sollt ich mit noch gieren, implies what Shaw's followers inflate to a kind of alternate mythology. After this one moment, while intriguing, none of it is spelled out in the Meister's poetic text, while most of it conflicts with the work's dramatic logic. Wotan observes the gold is useless to Alberich, who can buy nothing with it in Nibelheim. Yet, once it rises into the world as the dwarf threatens, it's equally futile against Valhalla. Thanks to Freya's apples, the gods are immortal, while they rule all creation through the irresistible power of Wotan's spear. Thus secure, gold can offer them no more than it can the world of Nibelheim. Logically, this means only lesser creatures who don't enjoy the immortal's advantages might be tempted by gold's allure, in short, giant mortal and other denizens of the surface. With their armed ranks behind him, the dwarf might indeed storm Valhalla in a physical assault, thus conquer it and enslave the gods. Yet, since analysis dismisses all this as a greed allegory, no stage production has so much as addressed, much less shored up this narrative weakness. Puzzling through it invites another look at the epic sources. The events of Rheingold Scene 3 are wholly invented for the ring, so have no mythic precedent. But their inspiration comes from the prose Edda, in which a giant, not a dwarf, flings a similar gauntlet before the immortals. He said he was going to remove Valhalla and take it to Giant Land, but bury Asgard and kill all the gods, except he was going to take Freya and Sif home with him. Alberich's boasts are a close echo. Denn dient ihr Männer erst meiner Macht, eurer schmucken Frauen, die mein Freien verschmäht. Sie zwingt nur lustig der Zwerg. Scene 3's words, zwingen and Lust, recall the dwarf's passionate Scene 1 musings. Zwäng ich nicht lieber, doch listig, zwäng ich mir Lust. The dwarves of Norse mythology, who assist the gods from time to time, are contentious only with the giants. Andvari's curse on his ring is no more than justice for Loki's callous theft. By contrast, the tetralogy's Nibelungs embody the mythic giants' hostilities towards the gods. Alberich's Scene 3 challenge transmogrifies that rancor into a potent, frustrated sexuality drawn from the mythology's hostile giant who clearly wants to abduct Asgard's womenfolk purely as a show of power. Alberich is no giant, but his Nibelung slaves present a massive equivalent in the thoroughly realistic picture of their burgeoning racial threat, and he says as much. Hab Acht vor dem nächtlichen Heer entsteigt des Nibelungen Hort aus dummer Tiefe zu Tag. Greed for gold is irrelevant without a social context in which having or lacking gold plays a meaningful part. Alberich doesn't so much threaten with his gold as with his army of night, his Nibelung brethren destined to institute a new society that makes greed for gold the social norm throughout the world, thus making it possible to raise that vast army he needs to overthrow Valhalla. The myth suggested to Wagner that the giants, who inhabit the world's surface, might serve as intermediaries between Nibelungs and gods, an idea he explored both in his prose sketches and Young Siegfried, the earliest form of Siegfried. He boiled down those intimations into his finished work, making the giants a single pair of onstage entities, Fasolt and Fafnir. That narrative dovetailing required a workable link between giants on the surface and Nibelung seemingly locked away in Nibelheim. Rheingold Scene 1 portrays Alberich peregrinating beyond this underworld prison, while the giant brothers Scene 2 musings confirm the dwarf has previously butted heads with them on their own turf. In Valkyrie, Wotan tells Brunhilde Alberich impregnates a mortal queen, while in Siegfried both Mime and his brother function at will on the world's surface. This can only mean that, after the ring is lost, Alberich's finest smith escapes him, in which case lesser Nibelungs could do the same, with nothing to prevent them from interacting with giants and mortals. In a sketch for Young Siegfried, the dwarf brothers confront each other at Nidhöhle, surrounded by Nibelungs. While the master dropped that episode from his finished work, Hagen's misunderstood Götterdämmerung comment leaves no doubt Wagner intended audiences to think of the dwarves as being still at large. Alberich seeks interracial sex when he woos the Rhine maidens, while, in Scene 2, Fasolt's obsession with Freya, never mind the frustrated wooing plans of Donner and Fro, confirm racial intermingling is possible in the Ring cosmos. This comes as no surprise, for miscegenation abounds in the myths. Frey makes love to a giantess named Gerth, a tale that provides the Meister with a great deal of his Siegfried Brunhilde material. Skadi, a giantess, falls in love with the god Balder, but is tricked instead into marrying another divinity. Dwarves bribe sexual favors from Freyja by giving her a fabulous necklace, and a dwarf named Alvis very nearly steals Thor's own daughter, in a poem upon which the Meister draws for both Rheingold Scene 2 and the Siegfried riddle scene. Interracial coitus, so common in Teutonic mythology, fails only when the lesser creature is unable to consummate. Thanks to the ring, Alberich now claims that power. While ring and gold are tools which turn nature's forces against themselves by warping the life they touch, the dwarf needn't explain further. Nibelheim presents itself to our eyes as his first test case, a dictatorship of fear and coercion, transforming his Nibelungs into a vast, purposeful race driven by self-interest. If gold is its coin, as much as, if not more so than greed or commerce, it's a broad racial social adaptation he hopes to spread throughout the world so he can checkmate the gods' hegemony and thus wipe them out. This requires an army. In Valkyrie, by gathering forces against such an invasion, Wotan proves he takes that threat to be literal and physical. Supported by the poem, Alberich's oration develops Erda's mutating natural energy syntax from the Scene 2-3 interlude, where the Rhine Maiden's joy, as passed through Loge's Scene 2 hint, becomes the definitive Nibelung tattoo. The interlude then echoes whiffs of reverse melody notes percolating through scenes 1 and 2, hammering them into something like a definitive syntactic module, with help from the air to chord notes. Once Alberich enlists the Tarnhelm to abuse his dwarves, this developing syntax eloquently portrays their coercion as well as their misery, a task it continues as the tyrant dwarf shows off his cruelty for Wotan's benefit. Once manifest in Alberich's defiant aria, this thread seems enigmatic, its dominant morpheme, the horde, reversing its 3 notes to their air to melody note originals. Yet this confirms Ring and Gold are ultimately aspects of Erda's power, as the aria's half-coda segments confirm by opposing the falling notes with their rising counterparts, thus linking them. Added to this mix, rising octaves signal that, through his gold, the dwarf masters the same sort of power guarded in Valhalla and wielded by Wotan's spear. Equally telling, reverse melody notes describe the subjugated dwarves and join those same octaves in a fusion prefaced by air to chord notes, together with octave leaps. While playing no major role in Alberich's peroration, another important syntactic thread running through scenes 1 and 2 comes to a head in scene 3 to establish the physical background before which the dwarf lays his claims, one directly linked to the ring itself through the ring fragment. The scene 2-3 interlude ends with a unique evolution of that morpheme, whose import Mima clarifies with his description of his Nibelung brethren, changed by the ring, not surprisingly prefaced by a wild procession of rising air chords. A special development of the fragment soon joins Alberich's taunts as he seeks to impress Wotan, which he quickly expands into a hail of repetitions. Nor is this the first time it's heard. Punctuated by it in scene 2, Loge tells how the dwarf forges the ring by mastering its spell, 3 pulses of a cell which then recurs in scene 3. This syntactic module, if unnoticed by analysis, nevertheless develops across the tetralogy as a distinct entity whose 2 major evolutions sound in morphemes recognized by the literature. Given it dominates that bundle of racial qualities Alberich spawns and Wotan later imitates in order to inherit the earth, for convenience this analysis has referred to the falling triad syntax as the Welterbe triad. More than an allegorical depiction of greed or commerce, it yokes active sexuality to the dwarf's push to rule the world, never mind the god's means of opposing that struggle. This closely echoes the prose Edda's giant, who threatens to seize the god's women. The tetralogy's poem, together with its musical syntax, develops Alberich's envisioned goal, forcible commingling his race not only with gods but giants and mortals. Even more, it ultimately comes to depict Wotan's efforts to defeat him in that very game, as spurred by the dwarf's example. Finally, the prominence of air chords in the Rheingold, Valhalla, and Alberich's ring-fueled power suggests this racial struggle plays a central role in her mysterious plans for the world. And so we must leave it until the next video. We'll resume where this one leaves off with Wotan's outraged response to Alberich's threats, the first stave of Dover's full score on page 196. As always, thanks for watching, and please do leave your comments. Time and energy allowing, I'll do everything I can to respond. Lastly, as all YouTubers know, your subscription to this channel by itself is a huge assist in completing this vast project. Hit the bell to be notified of the next videos. With luck and your support, there's a lot more to come.